Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Paes.
And today we're talking about the arrow line movements, but particularly we're talking about accessing these two arrow line connected points to our main type in childhood.
Both the teacher in me and the inner child in me are excited with this theme.
Yes, we often find that people ask questions about childhood, and they might say, well, I seemed like a different type when I was growing up or when I was young. And we do find that as children, we access these two arrows more than we do more easily or more consciously when we're adults. So we thought it would be interesting and fun to really explore this topic of how children relate to the Enneagram or express their Enneagram types, might be another way of saying it. Not in the most straightforward way. It's not always obvious. The child is not always just doing their type, right? Because they're children. And their personality doesn't really get set up or fixated or rooted until later on, sometimes late teenage years, sometimes in our 20s. Then we're really in our personality and really in our patterns of our main type. But in childhood, we see more interesting dynamics than that. We thought we would talk about that today. What do you want to say about this, Uranio, to start us off?
I totally see that kids spend a lot of time in one or both of the arrow connecting points of the Enneagram. And by the way, just to mention, we have episodes of the Enneagram 2.0 talking about arrows in case you want to revisit. We won't talk as much about arrow theory on this one, but we will a little bit. But kids spend more time in there, and we see that empirically, very much so. I saw it in many kids that I had the opportunity of seeing growing up. But also it makes sense theory wise because we access the true arrow connecting points when some kind of transformations happening, and transformation happens when we are open to something new in us, and kids are closer to essence, and being closer to essence they are not as fixated in personality. And my point being that it's not only that personality hasn't yet been formed, but also because to a great extent kids are more competent to go beyond that fixation.
Right.
And this means that they travel all around the Enneagram, but mostly to the two arrow connecting points. And it's beautiful to see. And just to finish this first part, I want to say that many parents believe that their kids are one type, and then after some years they see, oh no, they are actually that other type, and that was an arrow connecting point. So when typing people, we need to be very conservative, but when typing kids, twice or three times more.
Yes, exactly. And I think in childhood, in discussing this topic, it's really important to say that, like you're saying, I'm going to say what you said in slightly different words, but sort of agreeing with what you said and building on it. Children are both more what we might call primitive. And again, I'm using that word in a positive sense, closer to the ground in terms of primitive. Actions, reactions, feelings, just saying what they think,
Mm,
not being so conditioned or civilized yet, just
yes.
really almost closer to instinct, more instinctual, animalistic. Again, this is not a bad thing. It's a natural thing, right? It's being
Yeah.
closer to animal wisdom or just our instinctual basis.
Yeah.
Yeah, go
In
ahead.
Freudian terms, it's what he called the id.
Right.
So the ego and the super ego are not yet there with all the strength.
Right, right. We're still coming more from id, and the id sort of gets held back as we grow up and we learn we're not supposed to just say or do whatever we impulsively want to. But kids are still doing that. And again, I think when we're dealing with kids in a healthy way, often there's a certain amount of letting them be kids, right? Letting them do that. Of course, kids also need boundaries, and they need to start learning what's okay and what's not okay. But there is this aspect to children that's just more primitive, more closer to instinct, closer to the animal in a positive way. And
Yeah,
at the same time, they're also closer, as you said, to essence. If we believe that when we're born into a human life, before that, we were in a higher place or a higher reality, if you have that belief. Then the idea is when you're in your earliest years, you're closer to that, right? And the more we grow up, the farther away we get from our connection to a higher reality, to a more objective, absolute reality, to origin or source, as we might say.
yeah,
So when we look at kids, we want to see they're both sort of really in the animal that they are, and they're also they have more essential qualities that they bring with them that over time they lose as they become more as they turn into adults over time.
yeah. One thing that I observed over time with kids and parents is that when kids are displaying some things that come from one of the arrow points, the parents and people around them have two different sets of reactions, actually, two opposite sets of reactions. One is being totally fascinated with that in a very positive way, or being extremely critical of that. I want to explain that from a perspective of how growth happens in a collective sense, but quickly. So, people, when they see someone uh, displaying a higher level of awareness, people either go really against that person, even if it's a baby or kid, or they get fascinated and inspired by it because they want to spiral up together with that person. So there is almost no medium term here, it's either or. So I see that in practice, some parents do the great job of encouraging those behaviors because they are themselves stimulated or like fascinated by that higher level awareness display. But sometimes it's exactly what the parents go against. So two very very quick cases. A parent of a type 1 kid that I saw once would be very disciplining of the one kid when the kid was showing a lot of 7 qualities,
Mm,
exactly what not to do with the one. And
right.
then a type 5 kid's father would be very concerned with how intense and eightish that type 5 kid was. So that leads to a much faster and premature construction of ego and fall from essence.
Right. Right, right. And that's really important to think about because of course I think it's not hard to imagine a type 1 person who is more in touch with 7, that playfulness, which makes sense both as a child and because it's the arrow against, that what's sometimes been called the security point, or in the work of Sandra Maitri and A.H. Almas, it's called the soul child. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But you can imagine a type 1 child being in 7 in a beautiful, healthy way, and then a parent who, and it's interesting, sometimes you hear ones who had one parent a lot. That seems to be something, and they got felt criticized for that. And so that's part of how ones get kind of trapped in the one tendency to be more serious, follow the rules, and not allow this natural playfulness and fun and enjoyment to be part of their experience. And
Mm,
and I think the same for a 5 child. You can see how it would be really hard for a type 5 child to be punished for being 8ish and being more in their body and being more strong. And again, I think we can intuitively see that allowing for these movements, it can be very healthy. And so I'm hope maybe that's one of the positive things that can come out of this conversation, is that people can recognize, oh, if I'm seeing these different things in my child, I might need to give them some room to be in that as a healthy
Yeah.
movement. But before we get that, I want to make clear one thing, and that is what we're talking about here is that in childhood, children can actually access both arrows in a more fluid way, and sometimes in particular ways depending on the individual child, right? So we're not saying that there's only one of the two arrow line connected points that the child accesses, although in an individual case it may be that way. But we're really saying that we can access either arrow, right? And I think this is important. Maybe we need to say a little bit of theory up front. We won't say as much as we did in the podcast we devoted completely to arrows theory. But the arrow against or the arrow behind, like for me as a 2, that would be type 4. That's been called the security point in past work on the Enneagram. And the arrow ahead, so for me as a 2, that would be 8. That's sometimes been called the stress point. Now, very briefly, what we really don't agree with is an older theory, which has now been disavowed even by its author, that the arrow against is the point of integration, and the arrow with it, or the arrow that the type points to, is the arrow of disintegration. We don't like that language because we think it gives the idea that one arrow is good to integrate, the other arrow is kind of all bad. And we really don't believe that. And this is very much in line with the work of Sandra Maitri also, that both arrows can be bad and can be good. As adults, we can go to the arrow line movements, both of the movements, in a moment of stress, almost like as a release valve. And when we do that more unconsciously and more out of stress, go to either arrow, we usually go to the low side of that point. It's usually like, and it usually reinforces our ego, because not good things happen when you're doing things unconsciously under stress. And so we can go to either arrow in stress, or we can go to either arrow in security. Although what we mean by that, I think we need to start using different language to get more clarity on what we mean. But that said, when Uranio and I work with people working with the arrows, and again, one of the main important aspects of working with these arrows and talking about these arrows, and we believe the arrows are probably one of the most important concepts or ideas to work with when you're doing Enneagram work, is that working with these arrows in a conscious way, integrating both arrows, first the arrow against or the arrow behind, for a 2 that would be 4, and then necessarily after that that healthy qualities of that first arrow is integrated, then integrating the arrow ahead. And this is sort of the order that we believe it needs to be done in, and this is partly because the arrow behind it does have something to do with going back in time to childhood. And again, Sandra Maitri calls it the soul child, which is this idea that actually there's this deep, essential part of us that is rooted in that other arrow, and that when we come into a human life, we kind of there's an experience we have of sometimes that arrow line point not being supported, not being seen, there not being a way that it's sort of more okay to be in that arrow. So then we kind of go to our main point and we get more fixated there. We get a little bit more stuck there, right? And of course, using these arrows, the whole idea behind it is we want to create more flexibility around our main type. Sometimes people say, actually, we're all 9 types. We're not just our type. And I think while there's a something that makes sense in that, I think going to all 9 types is maybe a little bit too much to do in one lifetime. But there is a way that these 2 arrow line points are special types that we have access to, that if we focus on integrating those, we can create big shifts in positive ways for ourselves. But in our thinking, a little bit, because the arrow behind is a little bit like going back in time to integrate something that might not have been fully integrated in childhood. And then the arrow ahead is a little bit like going into the future and being who you can be if you integrate both arrows, because both of these two arrows, as you look at all 9 types, they sort of represent perfect antidotes or balancing out points for the two main types. So, just a little bit of review of theory. You can find more of that, more a deeper discussion of that in our other podcast. But here we want to just give you enough of the theory to make sense of what we're going to say about what we see happening with children around the arrow line points.
Right. Yes. And I guess I want to mention the thing about security and stress a little bit. First, I
Yeah.
want to say we don't emphasize that because we don't think it's the main point. We emphasize the arrows more as resources for growth, but it's not that we disagree. We just think also that there might be stress in the security point in other ways, and also people might get a little bit used with the arrow width in a way that it's both challenging but feels like grounding and could potentially be called safe. But let me talk about the security point being the arrow against or behind, as you said, and the stress point being the arrow width or the arrow ahead, as you called it. And what I want to say is that we need to have the right understanding of what that means. And that is when I feel secure enough in that environment to show that side of me, I will. So it's like I allow myself in this environment to show that side of me, which is a little bit what integrates my type in this way. Like it's part of my soul, it's part of my psyche, and I'm allowing myself to show that, right? So that needs to be understood. And then the arrow width or ahead is more like I'm venturing out of really out of the normal in a bigger way and exploring new territories that are even of a higher potential for me. But it can be more challenging, therefore stressful. And what I see is that um, with the arrow width or ahead, there are two options for kids. One is some problem with attachment with the caregivers is happening when the kid displays that second arrow, because some bigger stress is happening. But there is also something that I see that kids that are already born with a very high spiritual potential, they also display things of
Mm.
that arrow
Of the
because
arrow ahead.
ahead, yeah.
Ahead,
And
yeah.
usually the arrow behind or against is something that indicates a good level of attachment to the parents. And there will be solid ground for that kid to grow up healthily, in my view, most of the time. But there are different cases. I just wanted to make this point though.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I think our main point is it's good to see like what is the child expressing? You know, what do they do and say and what's their how is their being? How is their what are they living in that we need to see and embrace in a way and learn and maybe understand more about the children and not have this sense of, well, the person is expressing their main type from day one, right?
Yeah.
Because for instance, you hear a lot of stories, and the one that I think I hear most often, is a story about a type 8 person who in childhood did not look like an 8, right? You
Mm.
hear this a lot from eights themselves. That sometimes it's an 8 that was sort of very quiet and kept to themselves more as children, really living more in 5. You hear that, and again, you can understand this because sometimes what happens in childhood is the person's main point, their main type, the type that sort of they are going to be identifying with in this lifetime, is not supported or is discouraged or they're punished for aspects of it, right? And a lot of times children, when they're, 8ish, when they want their way or they're expressing strength and their power, as children, often we can imagine a lot of scenarios where the environment around them, the people around them, would say that's not okay. You need to be good. You're a kid, right? You're not in charge here, right?
Mhm.
And so again, I think this can happen in ways that are maybe, you know, traumatic, but also not as traumatic. But both can have the child hanging out at a different type, like 5 or 2, the 2 arrow line connected points. I've also talked to people who really, and this usually happens more in women, who thought they were 2s for a long time and then realized they're 8s. Why? Because they grew up in a culture where it wasn't okay as a woman to be strong or powerful or to express the 8ish qualities that they have inside. And so they're pushed to be more like a 2, which in some cultures, that's the way a woman is supposed to be. It's an archetype of, meeting other people's needs, taking care of other people, being the caretaker, and not the person who's out in front saying I want it to be my way, or I'm the strongest person here and I'm going to say what happens.
Yeah. I guess I want to make one last point before we start talking about the types. I My experience is that most kids access the arrow against more than the arrow forward or with or ahead. That is more common, and that's
Mhm.
what I see in practice.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Me too. Yeah, and I think that maybe you have to do with this sense of the past and the future in terms of these 2 arrows, and
Hmm.
also this concept of the soul child, which is really this sense of there's some aspect of our essence that is expressed by that point, the point against. It was also sometimes called the heart point,
Hmm.
right? And in the complete Enneagram, I kind of tried to put those together, like the child heart point, to kind of give this sense of there is something that is related to childhood experience, but that sometimes that isn't encouraged, or it isn't. Uh, it doesn't always get supported in the ways that might be optimal. And
Hmm.
again, if you're a parent, it's not about feeling guilty or punishing yourself. It's more just like we don't know what we're doing very often, especially if we don't have a great map like the Enneagram. And sometimes we're just doing the best we can, and we don't realize. Especially again, since it's a tricky job for parents to both love their children and let them be who they are, and help them grow and learn that they need to observe certain boundaries and do certain things in life in order to could grow. So I want to give that message in there also. But I think hopefully what we're going to say is something about the types, is something just to be open to observe, to get interested in, as a way of both understanding our children better and understanding the fluidity of these arrow line movements. And that when we're really in the optimal ideal scenario, we allow ourselves to access these arrow line connected points in a more fluid way, so that we do kind of have a more expansive personality, and we're not so confined to the limitations of our one main point.
Hmm.
So, anything else you want to say around the theory or the concepts of this, or should we talk about the 9 types in terms of what we see in children?
We can talk about the nine types from my point of view.
Okay, so why don't you start us out?
So we'll follow the usual sequence, starting with eight, going clockwise up to seven.
Mhm.
And for the eight, I had this beautiful opportunity of seeing my daughter, Bia, growing up right? And more kids, actually, not only her, that turned out to be eights. I want to say that my son, who I'll talk a little bit about also when we talk about seven, he was born in the year 2000, and I was sort of starting on the Enneagram. I had first learned about it in 1996, so 4 years, and I didn't have this concept of kids displaying the arrow points a lot. So I had more of a doubt about his type than I had of my daughter's. So she was born in 2008, by which time I already observed what we are talking about now. So Bia as an eight and also Hafa as a seven both displayed a lot of the arrow against, the arrow behind. And for Bia, it was a lot of two, in ways that she would be very sensitive. She would cry a lot, be very emotional. Also, ask for much more help than Hafa used to do, in a higher side of two, in my view,
Mm,
and being so sweet. Very hard to find a kid that's so sweet, but sweet also in the meaning of being so charming, and even to the point of being a bit flattering, like a chew, like, oh daddy, look at this, and please do that. So it would be really interesting, and very giving also. She wasn't much that eight who was on the quieter side, as you mentioned. Sometimes eights are, and I totally agree. I'd see that eights can be very much curious about learning things at times, as small kids, and more and also more reserved, because of the arrow to five. But Bia was this Jewish eight, in many many ways, and it was lovely. But I've never doubted she was an eight,
yeah.
because instinct was clearly very big. I
Yeah, can
remember
I
that.
say
Yeah.
yeah, I wanna say a little bit about Bia right there because, I've known her since she was 7 or 8, and, I really hear what she's saying. She was very, what I would say, relational. Like,
Mhm.
she was really like anyone who would come in your house, she would immediately, connect with them, just very, open and interested in people, but she also had a kind of assertiveness about her.
Mm.
Like, I
Yeah.
remember, like, I would go there and all of a sudden, like, she'd be my best friend, and we'd sit next to each other at dinner, and
Mm.
it would be this really easy, strong connection with her. It was so easy to connect with her, but then she would kind of tell you what to do. You So it
Yeah.
wasn't like completely just two, but it was definitely felt like sort of a little eight
Right.
girl acting very two-ish, I would say.
Right. When she was in kindergarten, we usually have those meetings with teachers at school, and they said, "Look, Bia is absolutely lovely, brilliant, and everything good, and she has wonderful relationships. She's very caring with kids. And the only observation point, is that when they play, like they love playing, like simulating as if they are in school and there are students and teachers. She's always the teacher. She's a bit disciplining and more, and she's a little bossy, but
Yes.
but she's
Yeah.
very nice, very soft. But I never
Yeah.
doubted she was an eight, because from when she was 3 months old and just learning how to sit down, and of course didn't speak, she would look at something she wanted, and she would do, "Ah," like with the belly thing, and being very instinctive.
Yeah. Anything else you want to say about eight?
No, we can move on.
I have also heard, and again, I don't necessarily think this is a male female thing, but I have heard more stories from male eights who talked about being very five-ish in childhood.
Hmm, tell
And
me
again,
more
this
about
could be
this.
this can be cultural, I think I've it's usually been something like, I was in a family where it wasn't really safe or okay to be in my strength, or to, I was maybe it was one of the younger children, or maybe there was a more authoritarian parent. And so it was a little bit like I just had to kind of um, sort of blend in. I couldn't really be out there with my normal way that I wanted to be, because I'd get slapped down. I would get sort of put in my place. And so I do sometimes hear that, and again, maybe there's something about, two being a more feminine archetype, and five being maybe a little bit more of a masculine archetype. But I
Yeah,
do hear sometimes men, it's sort of like I just stayed quiet, because if I said what I really wanted to say or acted the way it was really natural to me, there were negative consequences. So
yeah,
I think sometimes I've heard that sort of story from more
yeah.
from men that are eights.
And a type 8 kid showing this 5-ish qualities, it may mean that lust is still, under control and not as big, because there is this natural containment of energy that
Yeah.
later on changes, right? As well as going to chew, there is this open heart and vulnerability. So kids display very good things of both arrows most of the time.
Right, right. And we can see it's so interesting with the arrows that it's almost like you go to the place where there's a little more space, or maybe it's a little more safe, where there's more, you know there's some sort of reward or positive reinforcement sometimes, or negative reinforcement for being the main type. Yeah.
Right, yes.
So shall we talk about type 9?
Yeah, and I think you should start. Type 9 and type 2 are types I have a little less experience with kids, although I've heard many stories and I can share stuff. But I know you have a nephew who is a 9, and you could
Right.
identify who was a 9 from day one, right?
Right, right. And of course, these are not big sample sizes. We're just going from the children that we've known in our lives as sort of reinforcement for what we think could happen for the theory and for what we observe. My nephew is a type 9. He's now agrees to that himself. He's 18. And when he was little, I just from day one, he just really felt like a 9 to me. He was very tuned into the environment. He was very. It was so interesting. He was sort of blank. He would have a very blank expression, as if, and when families are around kids when they're young, they want them to smile, and they want them to talk, and they want to take pictures, and they want to play with them in a certain way. And it was almost as if he had this very deeply rooted sense of, I'm not going to be who you want me to be, like in a very healthy 9 way. And I think when 9 children don't accommodate or adapt to their parents or to the world around them, I actually think that's a healthy thing, because what ends up happening in adulthood is 9s adapt too much to other people, and they lose touch with their inner core, their being, what they want, their desires. And so in childhood, I could really see him. He would sort of just not say anything a lot, or not have an expression, almost as a way of saying, I'm here, I'm being myself, but I'm not going to be who you want me to be. However, I do think there was a way that there were times when he was really interested in something, when he would get more sort of outwardly focused about it, or be a little bit more three-ish. I don't see. I actually see a little bit of both arrows in him. He would, when he was young, whenever he really loved watching like movies and cartoons and different things like that. But he got very afraid very quickly if there was a bad guy in the movie, right? He would have a really strong fear reaction. And there were a lot of movies, like, little kid movies, where there was some villain that he could not watch it. And so and he would even like say, like, he was so cute. We'd be watching a movie together, and he'd start saying, "What's going to happen? What's going to happen? What's going to happen?" Because he like almost couldn't tolerate the suspense or the sort of looming thing, fearful thing that was about to happen, the suspenseful moment. So I saw the six in him in that way. Whenever we were, and again, there were certain things like he can't watch because there's a bad guy in that movie that he is too scary. But then I think there was also some three in him, in that when there were certain things that he really liked, he would really talk about it a lot. He would sort of be a little bit more in the mode of being on stage a little bit, and it became his thing, and he was sort of good at it. And I know that there's also sometimes there can also be a little bit of a that sort of deceitfulness that kids have, like mischievously, where you see a nine kind of like, I know that he would hide things from his parents. He wouldn't want them to see things. He would tell me something and say, "Don't tell anyone." Almost like he's having his little bit of his real story underneath, even though he's sort of, in like having an image of something else. Like, I'm showing them this, but I'm going to tell you the real story, but don't tell them. A little bit of having his own little private thing but when he was around other people. And again, if you look at pictures from him from childhood, he has the same expression in every picture. It's almost as if he's like saying, "I'm not going to adapt to be who you want me to be." And I'm also kind of hiding, which I think was sort of a healthy nine, but I definitely saw both arrows.
Yeah, so interesting. I wonder if some of the things you're describing might have to do with the arrow to six for nines.
Yeah, that's what I was
Like,
saying. Yeah.
yeah, I think even other things you said.
Uh,
For instance, I think that I've heard of type 9 kids being very anxious in the beginning of childhood, and being contrarians. And maybe what you saw in your nephew had to do with, a few of those things of being contrarian. Not only stubborn as nines, not doing what others wanted. It's more like um, not adapting in the six-ish way, not only the nine-ish way. So a mixture, I
right.
wonder. And
I
then,
do.
yeah.
I do think that he was rebellious, not
Hmm.
in an open
Yeah.
way necessarily, sometimes in an open way, but like, he had a type 1 father, and who, was telling him what to do a lot, and he would rebel in different ways. Some ways
Right.
that I think were very passive aggressive, and some ways
Mm.
that were a little bit more like you could tell he was having fun rebelling against his one father, like he was
Yeah.
enjoying
Yeah. Yes,
it.
and maybe it's a mix of the nine-ish passive aggression with the six-ish more rebelliousness.
Yes,
Yeah,
contrarian, yeah.
yeah, contrarian thing. And I've seen many nines taking longer to talk or to walk as kids. I think
Yeah,
that comes mostly from point nine itself,
me too.
but maybe there is also a little bit of lack of inner sense of security, sometimes the six-ish thing a bit too. But i
Yeah,
want to i want to speak a bit to the arrow to three for type 9 kids. I see, actually, I heard many students describing that when they were kids, they were like show offs. They would like to dress up, to sing or perform to the adults and expect praise and being out there on stage. So I find that very interesting
yeah, yeah,
and healthy.
def yeah. So let's talk about type 1.
Mhm.
Do you wanna start, or do you want me to start?
You can start and then I can add.
Um, I did have a one brother who I grew up with, and, he was funny in childhood. He really did his own thing. And I think in some ways that's one-ish, especially as a social one. Like, he did what he wanted to do, and didn't wasn't very open or flexible to other ways of being. And even like my parents, and this probably wasn't good for him. My parents always used to say he was a weird kid, right? But like when he was very young, I remember he had a really big imagination.
Mm,
Like he would and he went through this whole phase when he was young, like maybe 3, 4 years old, 3, 4, 5, where he would become other people. And again, you could see this as something seven-ish, because it was almost like he was living in a world in his imagination. Like for a while, he was Christopher Robin from Winnie the Pooh. You know, he was Christopher Robin. And if you called him by his name, he would say, no, 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 I'm Christopher Robin, you know? And so he would turn himself, and then he was Dorothy from the Wizard of Oz for a while. And this is when he was really young, and they wore little pants where there are snaps in them so you can easier access to the diaper, right? He would undo the snaps. So he was basically kind of
wow.
wearing more of a dress, and he would be Dorothy from the Wizard of Oz, or
Wow.
he would be Goldilocks from Little Red Riding Hood. I am Goldilocks. So it was almost like he would, in this very imaginative, playful way, become these other characters. And I remember just thinking that that was so funny and so weird because, you know, I was 3 years older. I hadn't seen very many other kids doing that. I had been a kid for a
Right.
while by that point,
Right.
but he was very much in his own, like creating his own fun in his own mind,
Mm.
in that way.
Very healthy. No, I think, yeah, one story is that when I was born, I had a sister who was 15 and another one who was 17 years old. So, what this means is that I was an uncle from when I was 9 years old. And I had actually six nephews being born between 9 and 15 years old myself,
Wow,
and
sick.
they ended up being six different enneagram types. So I had quite a bit of experience with them, and one of my nieces is a one. And
So you mean
when
you had 6 nephews and nieces?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Actually, three nephews and three nieces, and
Got it.
one of a different Enneagram type. And I could see them from day one, right? And already
Right,
I was from 9 to 15 years old myself.
right,
So
right.
the type one niece that I had would be very fun and doing some wrong things, like breaking some rules when she
Mm,
was very small. Actually, alternating between that and being very compliant. It was a mix. There were times that she would, still very young, be very critical of her mom, but mostly she would be very fun. And when the six kids met, she would sometimes lead the fun. You know, not always, because there were one or two of my nephews that were a bit more, taking the lead, but she would, and she would have a lot of fun. I remember that very well, but also doing the wrong thing. I didn't see as much the arrow to four in her, but I think that type one kids can be really playful and very positively so, and allowing themselves to express impulses as they come. You know, doing things that are funny, but also sort of in the edge of being wrong, at least.
yeah,
And but I've heard people say that type 1 kids at times can be very emotional too, very creative, expressive in the more artistic way, and and a little bit like um, seeing what's missing in the fourish way and not the critical one mind.
right, right, right. Yeah, yeah, and I think there are a lot of stories of of ones that were very seven-ish growing up, and I think
Mm,
that's, very typical. If I think of my brother, it's not like what he displayed was 100% 7, it was more like there was some 1 mixed in there too, right? So he was
yeah.
more seven-ish than he was later in life, liking to play, you know, being very creative in his play, but at the same time, needing to do it his way a lot of the time. right?
Oh,
So
interesting.
he didn't have that many friends growing up, partly because when they would play together, it had to be his way. And inevitably there would be a conflict, and the other child who had come over to play would run out screaming. So,
Mm.
so there was a mixture, but I think it's a very common thing. And of course, this is important for type ones to adults to remember and to know that it's really great for them in their inner work to get in touch with the child in them, to get in touch with
Right.
that playful, creative part of themselves that may have been sort of constrained or put down in childhood.
Right, right, right. And one last thing, I also had the opportunity of seeing more recently a type 1 kid. That is Renata's son. You know, Renata, one of
Yeah.
my nieces, she now has a
Yes.
type 1 son,
Right.
and he would be very happy, very, very happy in the beginning, but also very mental, like he would be interested in understanding everything. So I see a lot of the arrow to 1 to 7
Mm.
in him.
Yeah. 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 Interesting. Okay. So let's talk about type two.
Oh, you must start with this one. We all want to know how you were as a kid.
Okay, well, it won't surprise you to know, well, that I would say I was very fourish as a kid.
Mm,
But more, you might not have seen it on the outside as much as
mm,
I felt it on the inside.
mm,
And I think more eight-ish, but not in all ways, not all the time. I sort of had moments of eightishness. Like for instance, I was very eightish with my brother. I had an interesting um, childhood in that I almost never got angry with people openly, but I was constantly angry at my brother. Now, psychoanalyzing myself, I think I was taking out my anger at my parents on my younger brother. But there was a lot of sibling rivalry, a lot of, him trying to gross me out and me screaming and yelling. And so we weren't we had a contentious, to say the least, relationship. So my eight, I think, came out mostly with him, telling him what to do. Being, I mean, and it's funny
mm,
because when I was in like junior high and high school, friends would come over and they'd be shocked because here I'd be this really nice two, and then all of a sudden my brother would come in the room, my little brother trying to bother us, and I would just scream at him, like, and everyone would be like, "Whoa, like where did that come from?" So there was eightishness, but most of all, I would say I had a lot of inner experience of four growing up.
mm,
I felt like my feelings weren't always understood and supported. I didn't have a lot of help understanding my own feelings, and I think I felt a lot of need. It was a little bit like, my mother was also a two, so there was this sense of my mother's the perfect mother. She does everything right. She's so great. But in my experience, I didn't always experience that I wasn't seen. I wasn't emotionally supported. So it was a little bit like this, the four in me kind of saying, yeah, I know the deeper truth of the situation. The deeper truth is that, she may look like, and in some ways she was a good mother, but underneath, I'm not getting what I need inside, in terms of in things that made me hang out a lot in sadness and hopelessness. I remember having thoughts of like, when I grow up, I'm going to go do this and control my own life, because I sort of would retreat into sadness a lot, and kind of console myself inside by almost being with myself and my sadness in a way that was comforting. So getting more internal, uh, more in touch with what I needed and wanted inside, even if I felt like I couldn't say that or couldn't always get what I needed and wanted. And kind of hanging out in a kind of sadness or melancholy internally, and dreaming of the day when I would be able to control my own life or express myself. I remember even, one day I'll be able to buy my own candy bars and I won't rely on my parents to, you know, even that kind of thought, of just a kind of inner sense of sadness that you wouldn't have seen if you necessarily seen if you saw me. I was sort of a little more on the outside, more performative, more happy, more uh, in tune with others than my than and less in tune with myself, kind of in life on the outside.
Good to hear you talk about yourself in childhood. I'll say a few things in a minute, but first I want to say type 2 kids are many, many times very intense. But sometimes it's emotionally intense, and other times it's like physical intense. The 4 and the 8, the 2 arrows are very intense, right?
Mhm.
So, but I want to ask two questions and say one thing about you. So, first
Okay.
question: you sometimes share that your father made sure that you would practice sports, and then you became more physical. It was good for you. But do you think that as a smaller kid, you were a little bit physical, perhaps in the arrow to 8?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely when I say that my brother and I fought, I really want that was physical. Like
Mhm.
it was physical fighting often. And sometimes the physical part was initiated by me. Like he'd do something that he knew would bother me. And of course, as the older child, I had this sense of injustice because I was always blamed. Like if we got in a fight, my parents would get mad and it was always my fault because I was the oldest. And very often he in a very kind of mischievous way would poke me or would do something that he knew I didn't like, and then I would hit him, and then I was in trouble. So I would
Mhm.
say I was physical. I started playing sports when I was 9 years old at my father's encouragement, which I'll always be grateful to him for because I wouldn't have done that on my own. But when I did, and I need to emphasize, I wasn't good in the beginning. Like I wasn't a natural athlete, I would say, but I was able to become good at sports because I started young.
Mhm.
And because not being a natural athlete, anyone who starts playing a particular sport when they're young, 5 or 10 years later, if they keep with it, they're going to have developed some skill. So yeah, I do think there was a way that I was physical, but especially I would say with my brother. Like, I mean, I would really like get on top of him and like bang his head against the floor. So
Mhm.
I don't want to soft pedal this. I was quite intense physically with him.
Yeah.
But it was all from anger and I think injustice.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds like you were very intense, both in the 8ish and in the 4ish
Yeah.
way. So do you think you were more intense back then?
I would say, yeah, I think in the ways I was intense, I was intense. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that has to do with the arrows. But you mentioned sport, and I'm just remembering we need to have that tie break in our table tennis or ping pong competition, you and I. But
Yes,
that
that's right. We're
another
we're
thing.
we're stuck at 1-1. We've each
Yeah.
won one game. Yeah, when we
Now,
were at your sister's house in Brazil, and she had a very nice ping pong table.
Now, talking about visiting relatives, I want to say something about you. Of course, I didn't know you as a kid, but when we visit your parents, they have this long pathway in their house, and in which
The
it's
hallway. Yeah.
full, full of pictures of both you and your brother from
Yeah,
all different ages. And I'm a
right.
5, so I
Yeah.
observe and I classify, right? So I
Mm.
have in my
Yeah,
mind very clearly three sets of pictures of you. In one of them, you look so like introverted and a little bit sad, like the
yeah,
4, type 4B
yeah,
or point
yeah,
4B. In the other one,
yeah,
you're so charming and happy with that smile, so the type 2B. And then
yeah.
there are pictures that you were very young, but when I look at it, I feel scared.
Really?
It's like you're very serious and you look very, that one that could bang my head on the floor, So
Yeah,
yeah, so
watch out.
yeah, so it's interesting.
But there are a
Yeah,
lot of pictures. And it's funny, there's a picture of my brother and I. My parents took us to do a family portrait when we were a little bit older, like maybe late teens. And my brother reminds me, and I had forgotten this, that there's a picture of my brother and and my brother remembers that the photographer said, "Can you get closer to each other?" And he said that I said to the photographer, "Oh, we don't touch." Just said it very directly. We don't touch, right?
mm,
And think of it, twos don't really say that, right? So that's
yeah,
coming from somewhere else. Yeah, I will
yeah,
not touch
yeah.
him.
Interesting.
Yeah. But it's better now. Sometimes I've met people who've heard the podcast who think I don't like my brother. At this point in my, now that I'm old, now that we're old, we get along very well, and I admire him a lot. He's a really
Yeah,
great person. So, just for
me
the
too.
record.
So do
All
we move
right.
on to three?
Yes, let's move on to three. So why don't you start? What do you know
Yeah,
about
my type
three?
three nephew. He was very emotional from day one. Like with a very three-ish thing, like small kid going um, to a movie, an animated movie, and seeing the character and sort of imitating the character and like feeling what the character was feeling at the moment and changing the feeling. So very three-ish, like identification as the defense mechanism and shape shifting. So very three-ish, but he would be scared a lot in the early childhood, and also scared of the other kids because he was the youngest of the six, my nephews
Mhm.
and nieces. And so the arrow to six there and questioning things, really a big questioner. He was very, very smart, and that also counted, but he would be, I think I think the one that questioned the most, actually, among those six kids. And at times he would be very calm and not as active and being more contemplative in the arrow to nine. And I think that he was probably among those six kids the one that showed a mix of the two arrows the most. So
Mm.
yeah, and I hear many times people saying that their type 3 kids are very emotional because of the three being more in touch with their essence, which is very emotional, but also um, they say that they can be very mental, curious, and like questioners of people, kids that question a lot. And that speaks highly about the arrow to six and hard to trust at times.
Mhm. Right, right, yeah. And you do hear from type three adults that when they were children, they were more fearful, or they were sort of a little bit more laid back, not so goal focused, not so achievement focused. And they almost remember sometimes being praised for what they did or what they accomplished. And so kind of tuning into that and saying, oh, I need to do more of that,
Mhm.
like almost like they were able to relax before the messages of life sometimes told them who they should be, or what other people admire, and then they started the shape shifting a little bit more.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And I'm realizing as we talk, I think this is also maybe a commercial, an advertisement for doing more inner child work for all of us, and getting clearer on maybe what we were like that we lost, and what we need to get in touch with, or what we can reflect on in useful ways in our inner work.
Yeah,
Okay,
talking
so
about
let's talk.
this, it's both about observing kids in our lives, but also reflecting about ourselves and how
Yeah.
getting back to those capacities that we had as kids to access the arrow is actually good. Because sometimes we judge ourselves as if we did things that weren't good. Like, oh, I was a kid that was so much like that or too much like that. And many
Mm.
times that's the solution, not the problem.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Um, okay, so type 4. Um, do you want to start?
I can, yeah. All I mean, three type 4 kids come to my head right away, and one of my nieces is type 4, as I said. So all of them were very emotional from day one. And one of the kids that I'm thinking of, actually, the first, it's incredible. The first 20 words that she talked
That she
were
said?
emotions. Yeah,
Oh, wow.
and not dad or mommy, daddy or mommy or goo goo
Wow.
dada, it's like
Mm,
emotions. It's incredible. But I
wow.
think that's a little bit of an extreme case. And what I see is that many times they are very disciplined. Many times they are kids prone to stay organized and to be more like have more roots and being grounded and being serious, although they feel emotions, and sometimes they express them, yes, but it's more like they don't lose touch with the body. I see the type 4 kids when really really young, they have this beautiful connection to the body, because the
Mm,
arrow against is to one of the body types, the one in specific. But sometimes the 4 kids are also, they have that beautiful balance between paying attention to themselves and seeing the other kids, which for sometimes lose growing up, because they become too self-referencing. And when they are kids, they really look at other kids and they share and they are putting themselves in the same level with all that envy that comes later. But it's more like not only being inside themselves in the inner world. It's more like being in but also out, and practicing that, being with the other, and being there for the other.
mhm. Right, right, right. Yeah, yeah. I think that when I think of so I have a niece also who I'm close to, and she's a 2, but in childhood, when we were sort of, talking amongst ourselves, oh, like what type might she be? I always thought she's either a 2 or a 4, because it's interesting. When she was young, one of the reasons why I wondered if she was a 2, because I was applying kind of my more adult mindset of what a 2 is to her. She always knew what she wanted, and she would ask for it. She always knew, I like this, I don't like this. Oh, I really like, and she really liked certain things and didn't like other things. And she always had no problem kind of saying what she needed, in a very direct way. And she was also, I would say, like for instance, she had much more trouble than her 9 brother, um, learning to go to sleep by herself when she was young. It would be there was a period of time when she had when it was the she felt so alone when she went to when they put her to bed, and she would like be yelling down from her bedroom, mommy come, mommy come.
Oh,
There's like, oh, I'm so alone, it's so dark.
no.
And so there was this real it was I could real this stage where that, so the breaking of the bond, even just to go be by yourself and sleep, I think is a little bit too-ish as well, but also really in the emotion of it, in the emotion of disconnection. Even
Mhm.
at the end of a day when it's time to go to sleep by yourself was just something that was really hard for her. And there was this, like I said, this whole period of time when it was, her going to bed was like an hour long project for her parents, because it was so, so that was one of so I did see a lot of 4 in her. And it's interesting, she took our CPS test recently, and she actually came out as a 4. But she had, and she's 16 now, and she's friends with your daughter. But two is her in the second place. And when we talked about it, we talked it through, and she said, "No, I really think I'm more of a two." I think she's a probably a social two. She's got a lot of power also, but she definitely displayed a lot of fourishness when she was young, and now again, she's also very powerful. So there also could have been an eight element. I often wondered if I think I called that social two because I see social twos, and her mother is a social two and her grandmother is a social two. And I see them as sort of, in their power, having some certain level of power. But I think she has even more. So there may be a way that she, in a healthy way, has access to both arrows because she can tend to really assert herself at times when she wants to, and always has been able to.
Yeah, yeah. Just one last thing I want to say about my experience with type 4 kids is that they are usually more contained in different ways than they
Right.
end up being in adulthood.
Yeah, yeah. And
So
sorry, I got
being,
back off into two again.
no, it's good because we talked about 4 too in a
Yeah,
way. So yeah, I just want to say being more contained, 4 being more contained as kids, I think it has to do with the RO21.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Makes a lot of sense. And I think it depends on subtype sometimes how much they display their emotions, and what happens with the emotional trajectory. But I do think that sometimes they have like a deep understanding of what's happening. And I think part of that can be a kind of groundedness at
Yeah,
one.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to type 5. What I see is type 5 kids, and I'm mostly talking about very young kids, first years of life. Type 5 kids are really intense and full of energy. That strikes me as something that is very visible and felt by everybody around, which has to do with 5 essence, but also those two arrow points of 8 and 7, and sometimes confrontational, and they speak their minds and they go against, like good eights. And it's point 0.8, not type 8 in this sense, but still. And sometimes exaggerated, and a lot of something. And I want that, I want that, I want that. Don't they don't want to negotiate, and they are insistent. So I see a lot of type 5 kids looking like eights and being bossy. Fives can be very bossy at home, even as adults. But I think type 5 kids, when growing up, depends a bit on the situation, and if they have older siblings or not. But usually they take the lead. They are more like leader types, but only when they are very, very young.
And is that how it was for you?
A little bit, yes, but I'll talk about me in the end, I think, because we'll do something else today. We'll come back to doing a top 5, so I'm sparing that for later. But yeah, I was very intense in the beginning, and then eventually I lost that. It was sort of an overnight change in my case,
Mhm,
as I get told. But
mhm,
I'm thinking of one of my nieces a lot. She was very intense and sort of aggressive, and in a way
mhm,
that was full of life.
mhm.
And I try to remind her how wonderful that is, because somehow she came to understand it wasn't good, and I think it was very good. But also, I saw a kid that grew up. She had the same age as my son, and I saw her growing up, and she's a 5, and she was touching and caring and fun, and she definitely was a kid that used to go towards people and not away from.
Mm,
And then that changes as fives grow up, of course. But
mm.
I think it's interesting to see this mix of 8 and 7 for many type 5 kids.
Mhm. Right, right. Makes sense. Um, I hate to be out of order. I want to say one more thing about type 4 that I didn't. I meant to
Yeah.
say a little bit about the way type 4 kids can go to 2, because
Hmm.
I hear this sometimes from 4s where they remember being more pleasers, like adapting to be what other people wanted them to be, but it's painful inside for them. The
Hmm.
difference is that they can sometimes they have more of a consciousness sometimes that, ooh, I need to be this way to please people, or because people don't like the real me. And so I'm adapting and I'm pleasing. But there's always this sense inside that of sadness around that often, a little more than it would be for a 2 who would sort of not feel the sadness connected with that necessarily. But I like what you say about fives, and I think it's important. I do hear people say that they're five, they worry. I think sometimes parents worry about five children when they are a little more five-ish, and maybe this can be a little seven-ish when they're quiet or shy. And you sometimes see parents saying, "Oh, this is not going to be good for my child because they're too shy or they're too quiet." So I think I don't want people to get the sense that five kids are always eight-ish. I think they can be, and they can be more, have more access to that as children than adults often. But I also think sometimes five kids can be quiet inside and not be as social in a way that parents worry about when maybe they don't need to as much because they're just fives.
Yeah, 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 yeah. In my case, I had this type 5 tendency already as a very small kid. That before I knew how to read, I used to go to the family's encyclopedia and try to see things, and it's like I tried to understand what each chapter was about, and I would really stay with that more than with toys. But also, my older sister was already in medical school, and she had books in there, and I would pretend that I was reading physiology books, so it's very
very,
five.
very
Yeah,
five-ish, yeah.
but
Yeah.
there was an intensity about that, and showing off and feeling very good about that, and wanting other people to see that, and also
Yeah.
being happy and intense that later on I lost.
Yeah. 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 Okay. So let's talk about sixes.
Mm. Yeah, yet another nephew of mine, the oldest of those six,
Mhm.
turned out to be a six. And I was 9 years old when he was born. So I was an older kid that was
Mhm.
really excited with his presence, and we would play a lot together and more. And I see that I was like a reference for him as an older kid. It usually
Mhm.
happens with small kids, right?
Mhm.
But
Yep.
also he would show a lot of courage when we played in doing the things that I was doing, especially
Mm.
kicking balls and playing soccer and more, and sometimes inside the house's living room, and sometimes breaking stuff. And he would be much more compliant later when he grew up. So he would be more courageous of challenging stuff, and you know being prone to having risks. There was a play we had of sitting on the sofa and falling down behind it, and he would do it with cushions underneath, and so very courageous, especially for a smaller kid. But also, I think he displayed a lot of nine. There were so many times that he was just cool down and being relaxing, and he didn't feel anxious, and he would be just observing and being open to whatever came. So I remember this very nine-ish energy from him also.
Mhm. Mhm. Interesting. So it
Yeah.
sounds like we're sort of saying most of the time we see the arrow behind the soul child or the it
Mm,
sounds like that's the I'm hearing that in our conversation.
right.
Okay, so anything else about type 6 before we move to type 7?
Well, sometimes I hear people saying that when they were young, like type 6 students saying when they were small kids, that they also like to show off more and to take the lead and to be go into action very fast, so the arrow to 3 sometimes is there too.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about type 7.
Right. So yeah, my son and my the last of my nephews that I've been talking about. So and I saw other Type 7 kids growing up. So yeah. So stories about my son. I up to a certain time, like when he was 3 years old, I wasn't sure if he was a 7 or a 5. Then eventually I saw he was a 7, but the reason was he would be very introspective, and
Mhm.
growing up he would be completely different. And by the way, I see that Type 7 kids change all of a sudden overnight from being shy to being really outgoing, and
Hmm.
that's very very common. Or introverts that becoming extroverts, and I've seen actually a 7 describe, actually we are introverts in the inside and we don't show that, and we look more extroverts than we really are. Some sevens have that experience, but my son, when he was like before 1 and between 1 and 2, he would be the quietest kid I've ever seen by far, and extremely concentrated. And I remember that he would stay with one toy only and would not go to the other ones, sometimes for a couple of hours. And he wouldn't see the whole toy. He would go to this screw on the toy and
Screw.
screw on the toy and concentrate in that and touch it and observe it and being entertained with the screw on the toy. And so five-ish in many
Mhm.
ways. And he would not speak much. He would be very silent, very quiet, and enjoy his time alone all the time, but then
Mhm.
also being extremely inventive, creative, and charming, and also happy, but not happy as in showing happiness as much when he was very, very young. But growing up, way more. So there was I had a real question if he was a 7 or a 5, but
Mhm.
knowing this theory more, I would suspect more that he was a 7, because how much kids go to the arrow against, right? So 5 is the arrow against for Type 7.
Mhm. Right, right, right. Interesting. And so it sounds like having some experience there, but then as he grew older, you could start to see more sevenish traits in him. That was something that he had more when he was younger, but didn't stay at a certain point. Like you said, he really shifted. And one thing I always think is really funny about your son is when I met him, he was, he was teenager, but he played guitar quite well. But you told me he would never finish a song.
Never ever. I
That
don't think
is
I've
so
ever
seven.
seen him finish a song.
Like to be a good guitar player and to play songs on the guitar is like something really cool. And he never finishes a song. It's so funny.
Yeah, yeah. And also he goes for creating songs at the moment instead of playing songs that everybody will sing along, you know. So yeah, and more, yeah, and changing the song genre in the middle. It's
This
even not the
changing the song what?
genre,
Genre?
yeah,
Genre?
genre in the middle. It's not
So, like,
only
playing
changing the
a country
song,
song and then a
like
jazz song?
bossa nova and going to
Awesome.
jazz and back to rock and roll, and so it's like
Not
it's
only does he
great.
change the song, he changes the whole genre.
Oh
Funny.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's my point. And also my nephew, another 7, he was very shy. Maybe the shyest of all 6 nephews and nieces I had, and a 7 today. And he was also quiet. He was more in the shy side, like staying behind the other kids in that group.
Mhm. Right,
So
beautiful.
interesting how 7s can display a lot of 5.
Yes, yes. Okay, so last any last thing you wanna say to wrap this up, or should we just move on to our top 5?
I can't wait. Let's move on.
It's time for our top 5.
Oh, what's our top 5 today, B?
Our top 5 is the top 5 things we like most about our inner child.
Our own inner
Our
child.
own inner child, right, and we're doing this suggesting that all the listeners and viewers out there do the same thing, that we wanna inspire with this podcast, reflection on your own inner child, because I think sometimes it can be hard. I remember when I first went into therapy in my 30s, and my therapist wanted me to get in touch with my inner child. I thought that was the worst idea ever, right? So there can be resistance against this, but it's a good thing. So, what are the top 5 things you like most about your inner child? Why don't you start us off, Uranio?
Yeah, my number 5 is that I was a real dreamer, fantasizing and being, just thinking of possibilities. So very 7ish. I like
Mm,
that in me. I like that when I look back. It
mhm,
inspires me today to
mhm.
never stop dreaming. What about you?
Beautiful,
What's your number 5?
beautiful. My number 5 is that my inner child could be very assertive and opinionated, and would share her opinions very openly and strongly. Later on, I think I lost that.
And do you think that's more 8 or also a bit of 4?
Yeah, I think it was kind of both, but
Hmm.
definitely a kind of assertiveness, especially like the forcefulness. Let's say I would have with my brother. There was some bad stuff in there too, but there was a kind of forcefulness that I
Mm.
really lost by the time I was older.
Mm. Sounds like you said a lot of no's in a good way. Yeah.
Yes, exactly,
So
exactly.
my
So
number
what's
4 is that
your
I had I like that I had this good balance between being rebel and being compliant. So I was partly rebel, partly compliant. And I like that because I spent all my teenage years and early adulthood being way more in the obedient side and compliant side. And I didn't like being like that. And then later in life, as you may know, I became maybe too much of a rebel. And I think that kid had the wisdom of being both and leaning towards one and towards the other somehow.
mm-hmm. I like that. So I would say my number 4 is that my when I was young, I was clear on what I needed and wanted, and didn't need approval in order to want something or need something.
Oh, very good. Very good. Yeah,
Yeah.
my number 3 is being full of energy. As I said, type 5 kids usually are. And I was
Mm,
definitely like that, performing for everybody and jumping all around and going down the stairs very fast and sometimes having problems because of that, and all things like this. And I think it's a lot of 8 but also some 7 in there.
mhm, mhm. I would say my number 3 is that she was sensitive in a good way. You
Hmm.
know, Oh,
How so?
in touch with feelings, didn't apologize for her feelings, and sensitive to other people's feelings, but in a good
Mm,
way, not in a way that was overdone or,
mm,
um, you know, and I think it's good for it's normal and healthy for children to be sensitive.
right. Yeah. So my number two is that my inner child was really happy. And
Mm,
later in life, a little bit because of depression moments, I lost that. And
mm,
I've been more and more recovering that trait of my inner child. I think I've always been positive, even in all my adult years, but that kid
mm,
was even more so and connected to happiness. So a lot of
mm.
good seven stuff.
Great. My number two is that she didn't apologize for her feelings or get embarrassed about having feelings. When I was more in adulthood, I really had to contend with the fact that I would always say sorry if I had a feeling, or I would, sort of not want to show feelings because it was too embarrassing. And I think she was really in her feelings in a good way.
Mhm. Well, my number one is creativity. I think that kid had a lot of creativity in inventing, things to play with, not, the ordinary kind of play, and even talks and ideas. Lot of seven in there, and I think I did have more of seven than eight in me as a kid. But I think that was so central that I don't think I've ever lost touch with that completely. Even as a teenager or in my young adult years, I think I retained that capacity to create things new and from scratch and doing things differently and more. So that is the most inspiring thing I see in my inner child.
Beautiful. I love that. My number one is capacity to have fun,
Mm,
to do what she really loves to do, likes to do, and really get into the experience and have fun. I mean, I can still have fun. I mean, I'm pretty hedonistic and fun
yeah.
loving as an adult, but like I notice sometimes it's mixed. Like I have some fun things planned for this weekend, and for some reason, there's a little bit of worry mixed in there, a little bit of, I don't know. It's not this like full on openness to just living life and the fun and depth and of life without any kind of worry, anxiety, holding back, anything like that.
Mhm. Yeah, I do think you have great ability to have fun still, and to be fun and to laugh, and yeah. So yeah, I can see the inner child in you, um, having learned that from very early ages.
Mm, I'll take that as a compliment. Okay, so that does it for this episode. We want to thank you so much for listening and viewing this episode of the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. Join us again next time when we talk about all things Enneagram.